In the shadows of America's untold history, there are moments that changed everything. Moments when one person's courage rewrote what was possible in a land built on division. The year was 1880, the New Mexico Territory, a time when a black man's dignity was as fragile as morning frost, and an Apache woman's life was worth less than the water she drank. What happened that autumn day by Silver Lake wasn't just about kindness or courage. It was about something America wasn't ready to face, the power of dignity when it stands against an entire town's hatred. They say the town fell silent for a full minute. Some say it was shame, others say it was fear. But what no history book ever recorded was how that silence grew into something that would change the frontier forever. Stay with me until the very end, because what this black rancher didn't just save one life, it started a revolution of the human spirit that echoes to this very day. If this is your first time here at the Black Rancher, you've just stumbled upon America's hidden histories, the stories textbooks were too afraid to tell. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring that notification bell, because these aren't just stories, they're missing chapters of American history that deserve to be heard. And trust me, you're going to want to stay until the very end of this video. The final chapter contains a revelation that will completely change how you see the American frontier. Share this with someone who needs to know that courage has always come in every color and culture. Now let's journey to the New Mexico Territory, 1880, where our story begins. Silver Lake, New Mexico Territory, October 1880. The first frost of autumn had settled over the New Mexico Territory, painting the dawn sky in shades of crimson and gold. Solomon Rivers pulled his coat tighter against the chill as he guided his horse along the shore of Silver Lake, his breath forming small clouds that disappeared into the morning air. At 37, Solomon carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who had survived both slavery and war. His broad shoulders and calloused hands spoke of years of hard labor, but his eyes, alert and observant, revealed his true nature. Those eyes had seen too much cruelty to be easily deceived, and too much beauty to have lost hope. The Northern Star Ranch was his life's achievement, 400 acres of good grazing land he'd purchased after years of saving every penny he earned as a trail hand. It wasn't the biggest spread in the territory, but it was his. And in a world where black ownership was still viewed with suspicion and resentment, that meant everything. Solomon dismounted at his usual spot, leading his chestnut stallion to drink from the crystal-clear waters of Silver Lake. This morning ritual gave him time to think, to plan, to prepare for whatever challenges the day might bring. In these quiet moments, he found peace. But today, that peace was shattered by a sound that didn't belong. A soft whimper carried on the morning breeze. Solomon tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. The New Mexico Territory was still wild country. Apache raids, though less frequent now, remained a threat. Outlaws seeking refuge from the law often passed through these parts. Caution had kept him alive this long. "Who's there?" he called, his deep voice steady despite his racing heart. No answer came, but as he scanned the shoreline, he spotted a huddled figure half hidden among the reeds. Moving cautiously closer, the figure took shape, a woman, wrapped in a tattered blanket, her body shivering violently in the morning cold. She was Apache, that much was clear from her features and the traditional garments visible beneath the blanket. Her face was gaunt, her dark eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. A deep gash ran along her forearm, crudely bandaged with a strip of cloth now stiff with dried blood. Solomon holstered his weapon. Whatever this woman was, she was no threat, at least not in her current state. He approached slowly, hands open at his sides. "You hurt?" he asked, knowing she might not understand his words, but hoping his tone would convey his intent. The woman drew back, clutching the blanket tighter. Her eyes darted past him, scanning the shoreline as if expecting others to appear. "I won't harm you," Solomon continued, crouching down to appear less threatening. "I have food, medicine at my ranch." For a long moment, neither moved. Then, as if making a desperate calculation, the woman gave a slight nod. Solomon didn't know it then, but that simple nod would set in motion events that would test everything he believed about courage, dignity, and what it meant to be human in a land where such concepts were applied selectively. Little did he know that by nightfall his name would be on every tongue in Silverton, and the choice he was about to make would silence an entire town. The main street of Silverton bustled with the usual weekday activity as Solomon guided his horse through town, the Apache woman seated behind him, still wrapped in her blanket. He could feel her tense with each passing stranger, her fingers gripping the back of his coat. Solomon understood her fear all too well. For him, entering Silverton always meant steeling himself against the sideways glances, the muttered comments, the shopkeepers who mysteriously needed to check their stock when he entered. As the only black rancher in the county, his success bred as much resentment as it did grudging respect. But today was different. Today he carried a burden that would turn those sideways glances into open stares. "Rivers!" The shout came from outside the general store, where Sheriff Thomas Blackwood stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt. At 52, Blackwood was a relic of the old frontier, a man who wore his prejudices as openly as his badge. "What in God's name have you got there?" Solomon reined in his horse, keeping his expression neutral despite the anger flaring in his chest. "Woman needs a doctor, Sheriff. Found her by the lake, wounded and half-starved." By now, a small crowd had begun to gather. Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, gasped audibly when she caught sight of the Apache woman. Jeremiah Colt, who owned the largest cattle operation in the territory, spat in the dirt. "That's Apache," Colt said, his voice thick with disgust. "You bringing enemies right into our town, Rivers?" Solomon met the man's gaze steadily. "I'm bringing a human being who needs help." "Help?" Colt laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "You know what those savages did to the Miller family last spring? Killed them all, even the children." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the growing crowd. The Apache wars had left deep scars in the territory, and memories were long. "This woman didn't kill anyone," Solomon replied, "and she'll die without help." Sheriff Blackwood stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered pistol. "We got no doctor for Apaches here, Rivers. Best you take your guest and head back to your ranch, or better yet, leave her where you found her. Nature has a way of solving problems." Solomon felt the woman's grip tighten on his coat, and though she couldn't understand the words, the hatred in the voices needed no translation. "Is that what we are now, Sheriff? People who leave the wounded to die because we don't like the color of their skin?" Solomon's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the words. "Don't you lecture us about color, boy," Blackwood growled, emphasizing the last word with deliberate disrespect. The tension in the air thickened. From the corner of his eye, Solomon could see hands hovering near pistols, faces hardening with anger. He had pushed too far, and now he was facing a choice: back down and save himself, or stand firm and risk everything he'd built. Before he could respond, a new voice cut through the hostility. "That's enough, Thomas." Dr. E. William Hayes, Silverton's only physician, pushed through the crowd. At 65, Hayes was one of the few residents who treated Solomon with genuine respect. "Bring her to my office, Mr. Rivers." "Bill, you can't be serious," Colt protested. "That's an Apache." Hayes turned to face the crowd, his weathered face set in lines of determination. "I took an oath to heal the sick. Didn't say anything in that oath about checking tribal affiliations first." For a moment it seemed the crowd might turn on the doctor as well. Then Martha Hayes, the doctor's wife, emerged from the gathered onlookers and stood beside her husband. "Anyone who has a problem with my husband's patients can take it up with me," she announced, her small frame somehow imposing in its righteous anger. The crowd parted reluctantly as Solomon guided his horse toward the doctor's office at the end of the street. Behind him he could hear the murmurs, the threats, the promises of consequences. By bringing this woman to town, he had crossed a line. He knew, with cold certainty, that there would be a price to pay. The doctor's examination room was warm and smelled of antiseptic and herbs. Solomon stood by the door while Dr. Hayes tended to the Apache woman, who lay rigid on the examination table, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "She's suffering from exposure, malnutrition, and this wound is infected," Hayes said, carefully cleaning the gash on her arm. "Another day or two out there, and she wouldn't have made it." Martha Hayes entered with a tray of clean bandages and a steaming cup of broth. "Can she understand us?" she asked gently. Solomon shook his head. "Not that I can tell." The woman flinched as Hayes applied a stinging solution to her wound, but otherwise remained silent. Only her eyes darting between the three strangers revealed her fear. "She needs rest, proper food and time for this infection to clear," Hayes said, beginning to wrap her arm in fresh bandages. "But I can't keep her here, Solomon. After what happened in the street, it's not safe." Solomon nodded, understanding the unspoken message. The good doctor was already risking much by treating an Apache. Harboring her would be too dangerous for everyone involved. "I'll take her to my ranch," he said, the decision made before he fully realized it. Martha looked up sharply. "That's a risk, Solomon, not just from the town, but from her people too. If they come looking for her—" "I can't leave her to die," Solomon replied simply, "and I don't see anyone else volunteering." As if sensing they were discussing her fate, the Apache woman struggled to sit up. Dr. Hayes gently helped her, supporting her back until she was upright on the examination table. To everyone's surprise, she spoke, a single word in halting English. "Naomi." Solomon stepped closer. "Is that your name?" "Naomi?" The woman touched her chest and repeated, "Naomi." Then she pointed at Solomon with a questioning look. "Solomon," he replied, touching his own chest. "Solomon Rivers." Dr. Hayes exchanged a glance with his wife. "Well, at least she knows some English. That might help." Naomi's next words came slowly, each one clearly a struggle. "Why? Help?" The question hung in the air, simple yet profound. Why would a black man risk everything to help an Apache woman in a town that barely tolerated either of them? Solomon thought of his mother, who had died in slavery without ever knowing freedom. He thought of his brother, killed for the crime of learning to read. He thought of all the times he had been denied help because of the color of his skin. "Because it's right," he said finally, knowing the words were inadequate but unable to explain the complex web of memory, empathy, and principle that had guided his actions. Naomi studied his face for a long moment, then gave a small nod, as if accepting not just his answer but something deeper, a shared understanding of what it meant to be deemed less than human by those in power. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment. Martha opened it to reveal Sheriff Blackwood, his expression thunderous. "Town meeting's been called," he announced without preamble. "Council wants to see Rivers and his Apache now." Hayes stepped between the sheriff and his patient. "She's not well enough to be moved yet, Thomas." "Wasn't asking, Bill," Blackwood replied, his hand again resting on his holstered pistol. "Mayor's orders." Solomon knew what a town meeting meant. In places like Silverton, such gatherings had served as the prelude to vigilante justice more than once, but refusing would only make matters worse. "I'll go," he said, then turned to Naomi. "Stay here. Safe." Whether she understood his words or just his intent, Naomi's eyes widened with alarm. To everyone's surprise, she swung her legs off the table and stood, swaying slightly from weakness, but clearly determined. "Together," she said, the word heavy with meaning. And in that moment, something shifted in Solomon's understanding of courage. This woman, barely able to stand, was refusing safety to stand beside him. In a world that had taught both of them that their lives were disposable, such loyalty was as rare as it was powerful. "Together," he agreed, offering his arm for support. As they stepped into the street, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silverton. A crowd had gathered outside the town hall, faces grim and voices hushed. Solomon could feel the weight of their stares, the pressure of their judgment. Yet with Naomi's frail arm gripping his for support, he walked straight back toward whatever judgment awaited them, knowing that in this moment, their dignity was the only weapon they possessed. You're watching The Black Rancher, where we uncover the untold stories of black heroes from the American frontier. If you're moved by Solomon's courage so far, remember, the most powerful moment is still to come. Hit that like button if you believe in standing up for what's right, even when you stand alone. Now let's continue our journey to discover what happened when a black rancher and an Apache woman faced down an entire town. The town hall was packed to capacity, the air thick with tension and the scent of too many bodies in too small a space. Mayor Harlan Wilcox, a portly man whose wealth came from silver mining interests, sat at the center of a long table at the front of the room, flanked by the town council members. Solomon and Naomi stood before them like prisoners awaiting sentence. Despite her weakness, Naomi had refused to sit, matching Solomon's dignified stance. "Mr. Rivers," the mayor began, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd, "you've brought an enemy into our midst, an Apache. After all the bloodshed, all the raids, all the innocent lives lost, what were you thinking, sir?" Solomon met the mayor's gaze evenly. "I was thinking that a dying woman needed help." "A dying Apache," corrected Jeremiah Colt from his seat on the council. "There's a difference." "Not to me," Solomon replied. "Not to God either, I suspect." This reference to faith caused a ripple of discomfort. In a town that prided itself on Christian values, such a direct challenge was difficult to dismiss outright. "The Bible also speaks of protecting one's community," Pastor Williams interjected from the audience, "of vigilance against enemies." "And of the Good Samaritan," countered Dr. Hayes, who stood near the back of the room, "of helping those in need, regardless of who they are." Mayor Wilcox raised his hands for silence. "We're not here for a theological debate. We're here to decide what to do about this situation." "There's nothing to decide," Colt said, slapping his hand on the table. "The Apache goes back to her people and Rivers gets a warning. Next time he brings an enemy to town, there'll be consequences." Murmurs of agreement rose from sections of the crowd. "Her people may well be dead," Solomon said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I found her alone, half-starved. For all we know, she's the last of her band." "Then that's the Lord's judgment," someone called from the crowd. Solomon felt anger rising in his chest but fought to keep his voice steady. "Is that what we've become? People who look at suffering and call it God's will when it happens to those who don't look like us?" "Watch yourself, Rivers," Sheriff Blackwood warned. "You're in a precarious position already." At that moment, Naomi stepped forward, her legs still unsteady, but her gaze fierce as she surveyed the hostile faces before her. In her broken English, she addressed the room. "I am Naomi. My family, all dead. Soldiers come, kill all. I run. Many days, no food, no water." The room fell silent, startled by both her ability to speak English and the raw pain in her halting narrative. "He," she continued, pointing at Solomon, "only one help, only one person. Not enemy, person." The simplicity of her words hung in the air. For a moment, shame flickered across some faces in the crowd. Martha Hayes pushed forward through the assembled townspeople. "I'll take responsibility for her," she announced, standing beside Solomon and Naomi. "She can stay with us until she's well enough to decide her own path." "Martha," the doctor began, concern evident in his voice. "No, William," she cut him off. "I won't stand by and watch this town add another sin to its ledger. Not this time." Mayor Wilcox shifted uncomfortably. The Hayes family was respected in Silverton, their roots going back to the town's founding. Dismissing Martha's offer outright would cost him political capital he couldn't afford to lose. "This is against my better judgment," he said finally. "But the woman can stay with the Hayes family until she recovers. 1 week, no more. After that, she leaves Silverton, one way or another." "And if I choose to employ her at my ranch once she's recovered?" Solomon asked, his question a deliberate challenge. The mayor's face darkened. "Don't push your luck, Rivers. You've caused enough trouble for one day." As the crowd began to disperse, muttering their dissatisfaction with the outcome, Solomon felt a hand grip his sleeve. It was Elijah Morris, a fellow freedman who worked at the livery stable. "You're playing a dangerous game, Solomon," Elijah whispered. "Word's already spreading. Colt and his men were talking about paying your ranch a visit tonight, teaching you a lesson." Solomon nodded, understanding the warning. "Thank you, Elijah. I'll be ready." As Solomon helped Naomi back to the doctor's house, he could feel the eyes of the town following them, some curious, others hostile. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the main street. What had started as an act of basic human decency had somehow become a stand against the town's deepest prejudices. And now, as the approaching night promised violence, Solomon knew that his choice to help Naomi might cost him everything he had worked for. Yet watching her walk beside him, her head held high despite her weakness, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. Some principles were worth the price. Dawn broke over Silverton with the promise of another cold autumn day. Solomon had spent the night on the Hayes' porch, rifle across his knees. After Colt and his men had indeed ridden past the doctor's house several times, their threats carrying clearly on the night air. Dr. Hayes emerged from the house, looking tired but relieved. "She's doing better this morning, fever's broken." "Good," Solomon nodded, rising stiffly from his vigil. "I need to check on my ranch. Make sure nothing's been disturbed." "I'll keep watch here," Hayes assured him. "Martha's grown quite protective of our guest." As Solomon mounted his horse, he caught sight of Naomi watching from the window, her dark eyes following him as he rode away. There was something in that gaze, not just gratitude, but a deeper understanding that stayed with him as he made the journey back to the Northern Star Ranch. To his relief, the ranch was untouched. Either Colt's men had been all talk, or they'd decided that damaging his property wasn't worth the potential consequences. Solomon tended to his livestock quickly, then gathered fresh clothing, blankets, and food to bring back to town. As he was preparing to leave, his eyes fell on a trunk in the corner of his cabin, one he hadn't opened in years. After a moment's hesitation, he knelt and lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay his mother's quilts, carefully preserved despite the hardships of his journey west. Patience Rivers had been known for her quilting, even in slavery. The intricate patterns she created told stories of hope, endurance, and hidden meanings, known only to those who needed to follow the stars to freedom. Solomon gently lifted out the most beautiful of the quilts, a masterpiece of blue, gold, and deep crimson that his mother had completed just before her death. He had never used it, keeping it as a reminder of her skill and spirit. Now he carefully folded it and added it to his saddlebags. When he returned to Silverton, he found the mood had shifted. A crowd had gathered once again, but this time outside the church, where Sunday services were about to begin. The townspeople watched in silence as he dismounted and carried his supplies toward the doctor's house. Pastor Williams stepped forward from the church steps. "Mr. Rivers," he called, will you and Miss Naomi be joining us for worship this morning?" The invitation was unexpected, especially given the pastor's position the previous day. Solomon studied the man's face, looking for signs of a trap or mockery, but found only uncertain sincerity. "If we're welcome," Solomon replied cautiously. "All God's children are welcome in his house," Williams said, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed his own internal conflict. Solomon nodded. "I'll ask her." Inside the Hayes' home, he found Naomi sitting at the kitchen table, while Martha served her a simple breakfast. The improvement in her condition was remarkable, her eyes clearer, her movements more certain. "The pastor has invited us to church," Solomon told her, watching her reaction carefully. "We don't have to go." Naomi considered this, then asked, "You go?" "Church?" "Yes, when I can." She nodded slowly. "I go too." Martha looked concerned. "Are you sure that's wise? After yesterday?" "If we hide, they win," Solomon said simply. Naomi stood, smoothing down the borrowed dress Martha had provided, a plain, ill-fitting garment that emphasized her outsider status. "Need wash first," she said, gesturing to her face and hands. While Martha helped Naomi prepare, Solomon retrieved the quilt from his saddlebags. When Naomi emerged, clean but still wearing the shapeless dress, he held out the folded quilt to her. "My mother made this," he explained. She was a slave, but she was also an artist. Her quilts told stories that slave catchers couldn't read, stories about freedom, dignity, and finding your way north. Naomi touched the fabric reverently, understanding the value of such a gift. "In her tribe, my mother's people, a person's garments told their story," Solomon continued. "I think she would want you to wear her story today." With Martha's help, they draped the quilt around Naomi's shoulders like a shawl. The vibrant colors transformed her appearance, giving her a regal bearing that no ill-fitting dress could diminish. As they walked toward the church, the morning sun caught the threads of gold in the quilt, making them shimmer against the deep blue and crimson backdrop. Solomon was aware of the stares, the whispers, but kept his eyes forward, his pace unhurried. At the church steps, they paused. The congregation had already filed inside, but Pastor Williams waited at the door. His eyes widened at the sight of Naomi wrapped in the magnificent quilt. "That's quite a garment," he said, his voice hushed with genuine admiration. "My mother made it," Solomon replied. "She never lived to see freedom, but she sewed it into every stitch." Williams nodded slowly, then gestured toward the open doors. "Please come in." As they entered the church, the congregation fell silent. Every head turned to watch their progress down the central aisle. Solomon felt Naomi tense beside him, but was surprised when she straightened her spine and lifted her chin, walking with the dignity of one who refuses to be diminished by the judgment of others. They took seats in the last pew, acutely aware of the empty space other worshippers left around them. As Pastor Williams began the service, Solomon noticed something unusual. People were still watching them, but the expressions had changed. There was still wariness, still prejudice, but now there was something else too, a reluctant recognition of beauty. The quilt told a story they couldn't ignore, of skill, of artistry, of humanity that transcended the boundaries they had erected. In its intricate patterns they were forced to see evidence of what they had denied, the full personhood of those they had deemed lesser. After the service, as they made their way out of the church, something remarkable happened. Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, who had gasped in horror at Naomi's presence just the day before, approached them. "That quilt," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "I've never seen work so fine." "My mother made it," Solomon repeated. "Your mother was gifted," Mrs. Peterson replied. Then, after a pause, Would Miss Naomi care to join the ladies' quilting circle tomorrow? We meet at my home." The invitation hung in the air, imperfect and awkward, but genuine. A first tentative bridge across a chasm that had seemed uncrossable just hours before. Before Solomon could respond, Naomi stepped forward and touched the edge of her quilt, then gestured to Mrs. Peterson's shawl, admiring the needlework. The two women, from worlds impossibly far apart, began a halting conversation about patterns and stitches, a universal language that needed no translation. As word spread through Silverton about the quilt and its maker, other women approached, curious and then admiring. By the time they left the churchyard, something fundamental had shifted in the town's perception. The quilt, this tangible proof of humanity, artistry and heritage, had done what arguments and confrontations could not. It had forced the people of Silverton to see, really see, both Solomon and Naomi as people with histories, with skills, with beauty, to contribute to the world. That evening, as they sat on the Hayes porch watching the sunset, Dr. Hayes brought news that the town council had met again. "Mayor Wilcox has extended permission for Naomi to stay in Silverton as long as necessary for her recovery," he reported. "And Jeremiah Colt's men have been warned against causing any trouble at your ranch." Solomon nodded, understanding what had happened. The town had not suddenly abandoned its prejudices, but a door had been cracked open, a door through which recognition, if not yet acceptance, could begin to flow. Beside him, Naomi sat wrapped in his mother's quilt, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains where her people had once lived freely. There was still pain in her eyes, still loss, but also something new, the steady flame of dignity recognized. "What will you do now?" Solomon asked her softly. Naomi was silent for a long moment before answering, "Learn, survive, remember." Then she looked at him directly. "Like you." In those three words, Solomon heard the recognition of their shared struggle, different in its specifics, but alike in its essence. The fight to be seen as fully human in a world determined to see them as less. As darkness fell over Silverton, Solomon thought about the journey ahead. There would be more struggles, more prejudice to overcome. The path to acceptance would be long and often painful, but something had changed today. A quilt had silenced a town, if only momentarily, forcing them to confront the humanity they had denied. And in that silence, the seeds of change had been planted. It was a beginning, and sometimes that was enough. You've just witnessed the black cowboy found the Apache woman shivering by the lake. What he did next. Silence the Town, a story that reveals how a single act of dignity can change hearts and minds, even in the most hostile environments. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the Black Rancher channel. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that courage comes in all colors and that dignity is the birthright of every human being, regardless of race, origin, or circumstance. Your support helps us continue to uncover these hidden histories, stories that deserve to be told, stories that can heal the divisions we still face today. Thank you for joining us on this journey through America's forgotten past. And remember, sometimes the most powerful statement isn't made with words or weapons, but with the simple act of recognizing another's humanity when the world refuses to see it. Until next time, this is the Black Rancher, bringing history back to life, one story at a time.